First, we'd like to thank all the people who have helped us get here, and for New York University, Bickler and Brewer, and the excellent judging panels that we've had all day for this opportunity and the ability to present in front of all of you and all the people who are getting the chance to watch online. It definitely is our pleasure to be here. We also want to thank our sponsor, Mrs. Burgess, and Mr. Patrick Horton for coming with us to New York and sharing this moment with us. And of course, we want to thank all of our parents for the support that they've given us throughout the duration of this competition. With that, I would like to begin. Cool. Imagine a leaking boat. Two solutions present themselves. One, you can attempt to bail water out of the boat with a bucket as the water slowly swells in and the hole expands, or you can plug the hole and prevent it from expanding altogether. Climate change mitigation is plugging that hole. It addresses the root cause of climate change, carbon emissions. Adaptation, attempting to bail water out of the boat, inevitably fails as the hole continues to enlarge without a permanent solution. The rate of water flowing in eventually exceeds the ability to bail water out of the boat and stay afloat. The most urgent response must be the solution that best sustains human survival and benefits the greatest number of people. Short-term solutions cannot constitute the most urgent response. Should is used to indicate obligation, duty, or correctness, rather than to indicate whether something is possible. Mitigation best meets this framework and should be the focus of resources. Although differing scientific bodies report varying tipping points, the threshold after which the effects of climate change become irreversible, many climate models indicate that this will happen in roughly 40 years, enough time to successfully enact mitigation if prioritized. However, if adaptation is prioritized, passing the tipping point becomes inevitable, making natural disasters more frequent and intense. While both solutions, mitigation and adaptation, can be applied simultaneously, the limitation and reduction of carbon emissions through mitigation grants the world the best chance at sustainability. Negative will present three main arguments. First, the limitations of adaptation. Second, cap and trade. And finally, carbon sequestration. First, the limits of adaptation. Adaptation is unable to protect the diversity of life necessary to support humans. According to Rachel Warren, head of the Community Assessment Center at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change, an increase of 4 degrees Celsius, an inevitable scenario without mitigation, would exceed human capabilities for adaptation and compromise natural systems. One such system, coral reefs, will experience devastating deterioration due to climate change. Coral reefs are essential to human livelihood and biodiversity, as coral reefs support nearly 500 million people in both developing and developed nations, and 25% of all marine life. If mitigation is not prioritized, temperatures will continue to rise because of increasing carbon intensity, ultimately surpassing the capacity to adapt. Adaptation also bears a significant economic cost, making implementation impractical. The International Institute for the Environment and Development estimates the cost of adaptation to be as much as $513 billion, an exorbitant cost. As Thomas Homer Dixon, director at the Trudeau Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, indicates, the extreme cost of adaptation can lead to geopolitical instability and aggravate class and ethnic cleavages because conflict over resource distribution becomes inevitable when climate change limits resources. Furthermore, Marshall B. Burke, agricultural economist at the University of California, Berkeley, determined that as temperatures rise, agricultural production and incomes decline, leading to conflict over resources, particularly in nations like Africa. Burke further concluded that a 1 degree increase in temperature led to a 50% increase in the probability of civil war and 393,000 more battle deaths by 2030. In order for the continuous funding necessary for an attempt at adaptation implementation, governments must tax even those who are insulated from the immediate impacts of climate change, which will be unpopular with voters and difficult to truly implement. Governments are going to be spending that money not to improve the productivity of the economy, which would increase national wealth, but to prevent disasters that will otherwise severely deplete national wealth. Moreover, adaptation must be implemented by every nation to be effective. Adaptation measures in developed nations will not protect those living in developing nations, such as Bangladesh. The cost of adaptation hinders economic growth in developing nations because it diverts resources from other measures. Mitigation, on the other hand, does not require implementation by every nation to be effective, thereby distributing the cost more proportionally based on ability. In several developing nations, the nations hit hardest by climate change, weak central governments limit the ability to effectively implement adaptation. This problem is compounded by the lack of international support for adaptation in developing nations. A UN attempt to raise funds for adaptation in developing nations failed to meet a pledge of $18 billion. In fact, only $1 billion was actually pledged. Second, cap and trade. One system, cap and trade, sets a limit on carbon emissions. Companies then trade carbon credits, which dictate the amount of allowed carbon emissions for a company. While cap and trade places limitations on businesses, it does not hinder economic growth. In the European Union, a cap and trade system has been implemented since 2005. Over this time span, the program has cost only 0.01% of the GDP, and according to Brad Plumer of the Washington Post, not a single factory has moved out of Europe because of the emission trading system. Cap and trade has empirical success in removing carbon emissions. In Tokyo, cap and trade effectively reduced emissions by 23% over a 2-year span. Furthermore, cap and trade is gaining political traction globally. Cap and trade policies have been implemented by China, India, and several regions of the United States. In the United States, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, instituted a cap and trade system in the Northeast United States. It created $1.6 billion in economic value for the region. This plan was so successful, in fact, that the RGGI plans to lower their emission cap by an additional 45%. In the RGGI states, customers will save $1.3 billion in savings over the next decade. Countries see this benefit of cap and trade. While the benefits are global in scope, China's motives for implementation revolve around economic growth. Former Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao noted in a speech to Parliament that growing resource and environmental constraints are hindering growth, and therefore established China's cap and trade program, which aims to reduce carbon intensity by 40 to 45% by 2020. Wen Jiabao's comments indicate that cap and trade does not harm economic growth, but rather is necessary to protect a sustainable pattern of growth because it deals with the growing scarcity of environmental resources caused by climate change. Economic development cannot continue in the same manner it has in recent years because climate change affects developing nations' access to resources. Chinese cap and trade has important implications on global treaty making, as noted by Bloomberg reporter Alexander Kwiatkowski, because it breaks a logjam in global treaty negotiations by reversing China's refusal to commit to binding carbon emission reductions, a key component in U.S. opposition to binding emission cuts. Finally, carbon sequestration. An innovative solution in carbon reduction technology is sequestration, the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere and depositing it in a reservoir. While some carbon sequestration occurs naturally, such as with photosynthesis, artificial sequestration is important to reduce global carbon emissions. Artificial sequestration eliminates carbon from the environment by physical and chemical reactions without intervention of living organisms. A primary method of artificial sequestration is the storage of carbon dioxide in underground caverns. Projections by the Department of Energy, DOE, estimate that up to 155 billion tons of carbon can be stored in retired gas fields, while coal seams have a potential storage capacity ranging from 60 to 117 billion metric tons. The Department of Energy's tested the effectiveness of sequestration in geological and terrestrial environments in 20 experiments and successfully injected more than 1.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into oil and gas formations, as well as 18,000 metric tons into coal seams. Moreover, carbon capture equipment could reduce 85 to 90% of the emissions of coal-fired power plants, which are accountable for 43.1% of emissions. In conclusion, as climate change challenges policy leaders to design solutions that are both effective and efficient, mitigation must be the choice. Prioritizing adaptation over mitigation condemns current and future generations to an unsustainable environment. The success of mitigation technology and the circumstances surrounding mitigation demand that it is the response we choose. Thank you.